So it's official. About a week ago, the United States Supreme Court struck down the eviction moratorium. So what does that mean? What does that mean for renters? What does that mean for landlords? And was it the best thing to do in the first place? Well, today I'm going to share with you my experience as a landlord, but also give you some of my opinions about why the whole moratorium was not the best thing to do. My name is Shiloh Lundahl, and you are watching the Improved channel focused on real estate investing.
Eviction moratorium struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. Landlords can now start collecting rent again, but millions of Americans can also now potentially be thrown out of their homes in the middle of this pandemic.
Whoa. Did you just catch what he just said? Now that the Supreme Court ended the eviction moratorium, now millions of Americans can be thrown out of their homes? That sounds awful. Absolutely awful. But let's take a look at exactly what he said. And then let's watch a little bit more to get a little bit more understanding. But first, before we go any further, I do want to say something that's very important. This video is in no way to diminish the effects that COVID-19 has had on millions and millions of people. In fact, worldwide, millions of people have passed away because of this virus. And so I don't want to diminish any of that or make light of that situation for anyone. This video specifically is to address the eviction moratorium and what it has done to America. Now let's get back specifically to what the news anchor said. Millions of Americans potentially now can be thrown from their own homes. Well, as a landlord, I've never thrown anybody out of a home before. In fact, we have evicted some people, but over the last 10 years of being a landlord, we've evicted very, very few people. And in no ways have we ever thrown somebody out of a home before. So the eviction process isn't something that just starts and ends within a day and now all of a sudden you're being picked up and thrown out of a home. That's not how an eviction process works at all. And the other thing that's interesting is he says being thrown from their own home. You see, there is a problem with that, and I'm not trying to be insensitive, but when a renter comes in to rent a property, there is an agreement that is being made. And the agreement being made is, I will come in and I will pay you for a service that you're providing. And the service that you're providing is that you are allowing me to live in a home that you own. So it isn't that they are being thrown out of their homes. Even though when someone goes and rents a home, they go and they set it up as if it's their home. But the truth is, it is not their home. It is the landlord's home. And they are guests in that landlord's home. And as long as they follow through with their end of the agreement, and the landlord is following through with his end of the agreement, then it is a mutually beneficial relationship. So let's keep watching and let's see what else he has to say.
Late last night, the Supreme Court ended the CDC's latest eviction ban 5 weeks before it was scheduled to expire in October. President Biden has extended the moratorium earlier this month, but a group of landlords challenged that, saying Congress never gave the CDC that authority. On what happens next to the millions of tenants and landlords, here's CNBC's Contessa Brewer.
Across the nation, the Supreme Court's ruling on the national eviction moratorium has caused confusion, questions, and real concern.
I don't want to be on the street.
Yvonne Bryant is among the estimated 21,000 people in danger of eviction in Chicago. Nationwide, 6.4 million households are behind on rent, according to a federal survey.
Wow, 16.4 million households are at risk of eviction. That's a huge number. Or is it? What does that mean? When you first hear 6.4 million households are at risk of eviction, that seems huge. But let's find out a little bit more about that number and what it really means. Matt Terrio, a real estate investor and fellow YouTuber, did some great research on these numbers. So I'm going to put a clip from one of his latest videos in this video so you can see some of the research that he did that explains what that 6.4 million number really means.
Per AspenInstitute.org,
more than 15 million people live in households that are currently behind on their rental payments. 7.4 million adults, 6.5 million households, which places them at legal risk of eviction. And the picture here for me started to open up. 15 million people in a headline sounds much worse than 6.5 million households. And at legal risk of eviction were interesting words too. That's gonna come up again. But I wondered, how many rental households are there in the United States? So I went over to Statista.com. And I even paid the $300 annual fee to get the complete data on how many households there are that rent. And the number in 2020 was 43 million. So 6.5 million households represent about 15% of rental households that are at legal risk of facing eviction when the moratorium expires. And that's tragic. That number not lost on me. That's very sad. Now, my next thought, though, was what do the eviction numbers look like when there isn't a moratorium in place? You know, like pre-pandemic. So I headed over to evictionlab.org and found that annually 1 in 17 houses receive an eviction filing. However, the number is far less to those that actually do get evicted. It's 1 in 40. So less than half of eviction filings end up in actual eviction. So when you read the headlines, 15% of households are at legal risk of eviction, that seems like a real crisis. That's like 1 in 6 households. And remember that number, 1 in 6, compared to the normal amount of 1 in 40 that actually do get evicted. I mean, that's like almost 7 times the normal rate. Of course we're facing an eviction crisis, right? But then again, being a landlord who has never had to evict anybody, knock on wood, I couldn't help but wonder, why am I and all of my fellow landlords not experiencing this in our real world businesses? Where are these numbers in the media coming from? So I then went to National Multifamily Housing Council Rent Payment Tracker to check to see how many people are behind on their rent. And I found this right at the top, that 20% are behind. And it reads, 80% of rent payments have been made in August 2021 as of the 6th. Yet, in July, 94.9% of rent payments were made. That's like a 15% difference month over month. So right now, all signs, the most current signs, are giving this eviction moratorium crisis some serious legitimacy. Then I scrolled down a bit, and sure enough, in this chart, it shows that 80.2% of rents were collected by August 6th. But here's where it got interesting, where the lid of this crisis gets completely blown off. When you compare year over year, you'll see that last August, the number was essentially the same, 79.3%. And the year before that, 2019, the number was essentially the same then. 81.2% of tenants pay their rent by the 6th of the month, of where they then qualify to legally be at risk of eviction. So per this data, there are always about 1 in 5 households at legal risk of eviction, even more so than the 1 in 6 right now during the pandemic, with an eviction moratorium in place. When you scroll down the page a little bit further, you would see this. In July 2021, 94.9% paid their rent by the end of the month. 85% of those at legal risk of eviction are no longer at risk by the end of the month. And let's look at last year, 95.7% in July 2020, 96.6% in July 2019. Barely a measurable difference year over year. And the same goes for every single month. So, per the news, the facts that are shared are indeed facts. 1 in 5 renters not caught up on rent during pandemic by the 6th of the month and at the legal risk of eviction. That is factual. But what's actual is that's always the number, pandemic or not, eviction moratorium or not. What's also factual that they are not sharing is that 9.5 out of 10 tenants do pay their rent by the end of the month. And what's actual there too, that's always the number, pandemic or not, eviction moratorium or not.
Wow, Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate all of the effort that you put forth in gathering all of that data and then putting it in an easy to understand way so that we can see what a true picture of what rent payments are usually like pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, so that we can have an accurate view of what rent payments really look like, rather than a slanted view by a news media outlet that may be trying to lead us to believe that things are much worse than they really are compared to how things normally really are. So again, thanks so much, Matt. And for anybody who's watching this video that is not subscribed to Epic Real Estate Investing, I would definitely encourage you to go and subscribe to that channel. Matt has a ton of fantastic videos, and I've watched a bunch of them, and he does a lot of great research in getting you accurate information. So again, thanks, Matt. But now let's get back to this video and let's see what else they're trying to lead us to believe.
In Nebraska, landlords already are pressing to push people out.
We had a case just this morning where yesterday at 5 o'clock, I thought the CDC eviction moratorium was going to protect them. And then come this morning, it didn't. And it's a family, there's kids.
New York's new governor calls the Supreme Court decision appalling and insensitive. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi described it as arbitrary and cruel. Both women have promised to explore legislative solutions to the problem.
Now, again, I want to say that I do feel bad for individuals that are struggling with their finances to the point where they're having a hard time paying rent and that they are going through an eviction process. I do get that, and I do feel bad for that. And as I mentioned before, we work with our tenants when they are struggling with their finances and they communicate with us. We work with them to try to find solutions that will work for both of us. But going back to the video, did you hear the words that they used to describe the situation? Landlords pushing people out. They talked about the politicians calling the decision to end the moratorium as appalling and insensitive, or arbitrary and cruel. That's interesting. It's arbitrary and cruel or insensitive and appalling to enforce an agreement that someone made that they would be paying for the goods or services that I'm providing. Let's take a look at this other news clip that talks about a landlord and the experience that the landlord is having with tenants who are not paying her.
CBS's Mola Lenghi reports in depth on the consequences for landlords in America's eviction crisis.
Brandy Lacasse has been waiting on rent for nearly a year.
I've cried many nights, like thinking, where's my money?
Lacasse owns 3 properties in upstate New York, but the single mother and Air Force veteran is functionally homeless after falling on some hard times. Lacasse says after notifying tenants they had to move out so she could move in, they simply stopped paying and stayed put. She and her daughter have been living out of her car and staying with friends. Despite more than $23,000 in unpaid rent, Lacasse can't force her tenants out because of state and federal moratoriums on evictions.
I don't understand how they can give my private property to somebody to live for free. I bought that property, I fixed it up with my blood, sweat, and tears.
The policies were meant to protect vulnerable renters during the pandemic, but some property owners say they have become collateral damage.
One thing that's very clear is we have no housing safety net.
Vincent Reyna, a housing policy expert and professor at the University of Pennsylvania, co-authored a new report showing that nearly 10% of landlords around the country collected less than half of their rent in 2020. Small landlords owning fewer than 6 units were most affected.
We're forcing low-income households and owners to essentially bear the cost of that in this current moment. And that's unfair to both parties.
I feel bad that I have not been able to pay her.
Carla MacArthur is Lacasse's tenant. With child care costs for her daughter and an autistic son, she says she can't pay rent.
We've gone from 2 incomes. I have had COVID-19 twice. My kids all have had it once. My husband's had it once. We've been affected by the virus.
MacArthur has been approved for rent relief in New York, but the state hasn't paid Lacasse yet. So far, New York has sent about 8% of its federal allotment of $2.6 billion relief dollars directly to landlords.
I'm not sure what she may do when the moratorium's lifted. That's what I'm afraid of being homeless.
2 families trying to avoid the same fate.
I invested in these properties never thinking I wouldn't have a place to live.
On opposite sides of a looming crisis.
I just want my house. That's it. I just want my house.
Mola Lenghi, CBS News, New York.
Wow. I don't often see that. I don't often see that on the news where they depict a landlord in a vulnerable position. Usually they depict the landlord as the bad guy and the tenant in the vulnerable position. One of the things that Matt talked about was that him and his large group of people had very few non-payments. But you know the people that got hurt most during this eviction moratorium? It was the small landlords, the landlords that only have 1 or 2 units. And they had people deciding to not pay anymore in their units. You see, those were the people that were hurt the most because they still had mortgages that were due, they had taxes and insurance that they still had to pay for, yet they weren't getting income to come in to help them make those payments. And if the landlord lost his or her job during the moratorium, then they're trying to take care of themselves and keep these properties afloat. And my heart goes out to them.
The real harm has been impacted upon the small landlords who had tenants who were not impacted by COVID who did not pay. 2, had tenants who have absconded and abandoned the property.
I see in this situation that both are in a vulnerable situation. I understand that the tenant is struggling, and I absolutely get that and understand that. But is that fair then to take this landlord's home that she was renting to them and keep her from being able to access her home because now this landlord is homeless, but yet she has homes that she could go into, but the tenants that are there are not leaving. And so now this person who has purchased homes in order to help create some sort of income for themselves, she's in a situation where she doesn't even have a place to stay because the government has determined that they're the ones that are ultimately going to be making the decision. And this whole video comes to that specific fact, where the government comes and they make the determination as to what's going to happen between tenants and landlords. And that's what I have a problem with. You see, this whole pandemic created a great opportunity for humanity to come forth and be a support to one another. And it bothers me that the government decided I'm going to go ahead and step in front of what people can do with each other and showing kindness to each other, and I'm going to start creating mandates to make sure that things happen according to what I believe is best. So rather than giving landlords the opportunity to show grace, to show patience, to show kindness and generosity and support, it essentially took the private property of landlords and said, this is what you are going to be using that private property for. And by the way, you may or may not be compensated for it. That's what I have a problem with. And let me go into the psychological effects of this. I had somebody once tell me something that I thought was really interesting when they said it, but since then I've learned how true it really is. This is often how the government changes behavior. They subsidize behaviors that they want to see, and they tax behaviors that they want to see less of. Think about it in terms of those old non-smoking ads. Do you remember those? There were all of these hideous pictures and everything that were shown talking about the horrors of smoking. And it was supposed to create this feeling inside of you, oh, I don't want that. I don't want to experience that. But just like watching a scary movie over and over again, the more you watch it, the less those images have an impact on you. And so even though they put out these public service announcements about the dangers of smoking, the thing that really, really helped lower smoking was taxing cigarettes.
If you've been in a convenience store in Pennsylvania lately, you may have noticed a new sign up about cigarette prices. Starting August 1st, the tax on cigarettes will go up $1 from $1.60 to $2.60 a pack. The increase comes after PA lawmakers passed a $1.3 billion budget plan last week. Now, the average price of a pack of cigarettes is around $7. One local tobacco shop says customers are now looking for alternatives.
What happens is when you want to lessen a behavior, then the government comes in and they tax that behavior, and that behavior starts to go down. Now, the opposite is also true. If there's a behavior that you want to increase, then you subsidize that behavior. Think about it as in terms of investing in opportunity zones.
Well, first, let's talk about what an opportunity zone actually is. So the IRS defines an opportunity zone as an economically distressed community where new investments under certain conditions may be eligible for preferential tax treatment. Now, opportunity zones were added to the tax code by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, and in short, were created to spur economic development in areas that needed it, specifically by providing tax incentives to investors for investing in those areas.
So what does that do? It incentivizes investors to go into rundown areas and help bring up the neighborhood, help make it more safe, help make it more beautiful so that it will attract people to live there. And the government incentivizes you to do that by lessening your tax liability. So the behaviors the government wants to see more of, they subsidize. The behaviors they want to see less of, they tax. So what does this mean with this specific moratorium? As Matt just told us a few moments ago, that there isn't a big change with regard to rent payments or how many people are at risk of being evicted now compared to how it was pre-pandemic. So why would the government say, well, we want to continue to put this ban on evictions? I don't want to get too political in this video and say things like, well, the government is trying to, in one way or another, take over housing, because that's not going to be helpful in this video. And, there's a lot of people that will either agree or disagree. So I'm not going to go with anything political here, but I am going to go a little bit more in depth as it pertains to my own rental portfolio. So I told you that I haven't really evicted many people, and that's true, we haven't, except over the last few months, we have been going to court to try to evict people. And the people that we're evicting, as I mentioned before, are the people that are not communicating with us very well, and the people that are taking advantage of the ban on evictions. So one example is a tenant that was living in one of our apartments, and that tenant stopped paying over the last few months. And this tenant wasn't somebody that we had put into the apartment, but we purchased the apartment building and the tenant was already living there. So throughout the pandemic, we noticed that some people over time started to pay later and later and then just stopped paying. And we would try to reach out to them. And several of them would kind of talk with us about what's going on, and then we would make some sort of agreement that would work for them and for us. But then there were certain people that either just wouldn't get back to us or just ignore our calls or things like that. And so basically, we would go and we'd look to see what's going on. And we had one individual who was in one of our apartments that had purchased a brand new car and just wasn't paying us that money. We also had a lady who had lived in one of our most expensive properties, and she had stopped paying before the pandemic happened. We reached out to her trying to help her find a less expensive property to rent. So we have several properties, and we were trying to help her get into a property that she could afford. Yet she wanted to continue to stay in that specific home that she could no longer afford. And we had started going through the eviction process, and then she had a family member come in and start helping with payments. And then as the eviction ban came into effect, that family member stopped paying for her. And then she continued to live in that property for 11 months without paying any rent at all. And she was trying to claim COVID hardship and everything like that in order to continue to live in the property as long as she possibly could. And it wasn't because of the pandemic that she lost her job or anything like that. In fact, she was living there with her husband at the time, and something had happened after they moved in and he left, and then she no longer was able to make the rent payments. So that's when we reached out to her and tried to help her get into a property that she could afford. But once the pandemic started, the urgency for her to be able to move and get into a property that she could afford went way down. And then she tried to ride the wave of this pandemic as long as she possibly could. And that there is the biggest problem. What happens is when you put a blanket moratorium on all evictions, it makes it so people can take advantage of the system. And then they get used to not needing to pay rent. As somebody gets used to a specific behavior, they start to build their lifestyle around that behavior. And that can become the most detrimental thing for them. So in my opinion, looking at the facts and the data, the moratorium was unnecessary. And if the government had allowed landlords and renters to work together, I think that it could have turned out much better than how it turned out throughout this whole pandemic. I think that there would have been social pressure for landlords to be more generous, and I think that it would have kept the pressure on tenants to figure out ways to continue to work towards communicating with their landlords and creating agreements to help them get through the pandemic. So hopefully this video added some sort of perspective to the whole eviction moratorium. I don't have all of the answers as to why the government decided that they were going to step in between landlords and tenants and that they were going to create these laws and policies. I don't understand exactly why they thought that. I mean, I could get at the very beginning, we didn't know what was going to happen, but the extending of the moratorium over and over and over again, to me, it just doesn't make a lot of sense according to the data. But yet they did that. I don't know if it was for some sort of political gain or something else. I just don't know. But I do appreciate you guys watching this video. I'm going to try to continue to produce high quality videos for you to watch so that you can learn and grow in your investing knowledge. And if you like these videos, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd really appreciate it. And I hope that you have a fantastic day investing in real estate. Good luck.